Sarah Martinez adjusted her blazer for the 10th time as she waited in the marble lobby of Blackstone Enterprises. The 30-story glass tower stretched toward the clouds above downtown Seattle, and she felt impossibly small sitting in the leather chair that probably cost more than her monthly rent. At 23, Sarah had graduated summa cum laude from the University of Washington with degrees in business and computer science. She had worked 3 jobs to pay for college, lived on instant noodles for months, and studied until her eyes burned. Now, somehow, she had landed an internship at one of the most prestigious companies on the West Coast. Sarah Martinez? A woman in an expensive suit approached with a clipboard. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, head of human resources. Ready for your first day?" Sarah nodded, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. Her black blazer was from a discount store, her shoes were comfortable but clearly not designer, and her briefcase was a graduation gift from her mother who had saved for months to buy it. Jennifer led her through security turnstiles that scanned their badges and into an elevator that climbed silently toward the executive floors. "You'll be working directly with the strategic planning department," Jennifer explained. "It's unusual for an intern to start at this level, but your academic record and the recommendation from Professor Chun were exceptional." The elevator opened onto the 40th floor, revealing floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains. Sarah had grown up in a small apartment in South Seattle, where the view from her bedroom window was the parking lot of a grocery store. This felt like stepping into a different world. The CEO requested to meet all new strategic planning team members personally. Jennifer continued as they walked down a hallway lined with abstract art that Sarah suspected cost more than most people's cars. "It's part of his management philosophy." Sarah's stomach fluttered. She had researched Blackstone Enterprises extensively before applying, of course. The company had started as a small tech consulting firm 15 years ago and had grown into a multinational corporation with offices in 12 countries. They specialized in digital transformation for traditional industries, helping old companies adapt to new technologies. The CEO, Alexander Blackstone, had been featured on magazine covers and business news programs. At 38, he was known for his sharp mind, his ability to predict market trends, and his somewhat mysterious personal life. He had never been married, rarely appeared at social events, and seemed to live entirely for his work. From the photos Sarah had seen, he was tall with dark hair and intense eyes. The business magazines described him as brilliant but demanding, someone who expected excellence from everyone around him. Sarah had practiced what she might say if she met him, though she assumed it would be a brief handshake and a few polite words. Jennifer stopped outside a conference room with glass walls. "He'll meet with you here in a few minutes. Just be yourself, answer his questions honestly, and don't be nervous. He may seem intimidating, but he's fair." Sarah was left alone in the conference room, which had a long table surrounded by leather chairs and a wall-mounted screen that probably cost more than her entire college education. She sat down and tried to calm her racing heart by reviewing what she knew about the company's recent projects. Through the glass walls, she could see employees moving through the hallway with purpose and confidence. Everyone looked polished and professional, like they belonged in this world of expensive suits and cutting-edge technology. Sarah wondered if she would ever feel like she fit in here. She was studying the view of the city when the conference room door opened behind her. Sarah turned around and felt her breath catch in her throat. Alexander Blackstone was even more imposing in person than in photographs. He stood about 6 feet 3 inches tall, with broad shoulders that filled his perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His hair was darker than it appeared in pictures, with just a few threads of silver at the temples, and his eyes were a striking green that seemed to take in everything at once. But what caught Sarah completely off guard was the way he stopped moving when he saw her. He had been walking with the confident stride of someone who owned the building, but he froze in the doorway as if he had forgotten what he was doing there. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Alexander's green eyes moved over her face with an intensity that made Sarah feel like he was memorizing every detail. She felt heat rise in her cheeks and had to resist the urge to look away. "Mr. Blackstone," she finally managed, standing up and extending her hand. "I'm Sarah Martinez. Thank you for taking the time to meet with
Thank you
me.
for the update.
Alexander seemed to
Let's
shake
proceed
himself
as
out of
discussed.
whatever had momentarily paralyzed him. He stepped forward and took her hand, and Sarah was surprised by how warm his skin was. His grip was firm but gentle, and he held her hand just a moment longer than was strictly professional. "Sarah," he said, and she noticed that his voice was deeper than it had sounded in the television interviews she had watched. "Welcome to Blackstone Enterprises." He gestured for her to sit back down, and took the chair across from her rather than at the head of the table. Sarah noticed that he continued to watch her with that same intense focus, as if she was the most interesting person he had ever encountered. "I've reviewed your academic record," Alexander said, opening a folder that contained what appeared to be her entire application. "Summa cum laude, double major, thesis on digital transformation in healthcare." "Impressive." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. She was acutely aware that his eyes never left her face, and it was both flattering and deeply unnerving. "Tell me about your thesis," Alexander said, leaning forward slightly. "What drew you to study healthcare transformation specifically?" Sarah took a breath, grateful to have a topic she could discuss with confidence. "My grandmother spent the last 2 years of her life in and out of hospitals," she began. "I watched her struggle with systems that hadn't been updated in decades. Paper forms, disconnected departments, doctors who couldn't access her medical history. I realized that technology could solve most of these problems, but the industry was resistant to change." As she spoke, Sarah noticed that Alexander's expression had shifted from professional interest to something more personal. He nodded as she described her research, asked thoughtful questions about her methodology, and seemed genuinely engaged with her ideas. "You spent 4 months volunteering at Swedish Medical Center as part of your research," Alexander noted, consulting her file. "That shows real commitment to understanding the problem from the inside." "I wanted to see how the systems actually worked in practice," Sarah explained. "You can't design solutions without understanding the real challenges people face every day." Alexander smiled for the first time since entering the room, and Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. When he smiled, his entire face transformed. The intensity remained, but there was warmth there too, and something that looked almost like admiration. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we value here," Alexander said. "Too many consultants make recommendations based on theory rather than reality." Sarah felt a flush of pride, but also noticed that Alexander's gaze had become even more focused. He seemed to be studying her expressions as she spoke, watching how she moved her hands when she explained complex ideas, noting the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. "What interests you most about working here?" Alexander asked, and Sarah sensed that this wasn't a standard interview question. He seemed genuinely curious about her answer. "I want to learn from the best," Sarah said honestly. "Blackstone has a reputation for taking on the most challenging transformation projects. I want to understand how you approach problems that other companies can't solve." "And after your internship?" Alexander asked. "What are your long-term goals?" Sarah hesitated for a moment. She had prepared answers for this question, but sitting across from Alexander Blackstone, she found herself wanting to be completely honest rather than give him the response she thought he wanted to hear. "I want to start my own consulting firm eventually," she said. "Focus on helping smaller companies and nonprofits that can't afford the major consulting firms. Healthcare systems, education, social services. Organizations that serve people who really need better technology but don't have the resources to pay for it." Alexander's eyebrows rose slightly, and Sarah worried that she had made a mistake by admitting she didn't plan to stay at Blackstone long term. But when she looked at his expression, she saw something that looked like respect. "That's admirable," Alexander said quietly. "Not many people in this industry think about serving organizations that can't pay premium rates." There was something in his tone that made Sarah think he understood exactly what she meant. Despite his wealth and success, Alexander Blackstone didn't seem like someone who had forgotten where he came from. "I believe technology should make life better for everyone," Sarah said. "Not just for people who can afford the best." Alexander nodded slowly, and Sarah noticed that he seemed to be looking at her with a new kind of intensity. It wasn't just professional interest anymore. There was something personal in his gaze, something that made her acutely aware of the fact that they were alone in the conference room. "Jennifer mentioned that you worked 3 jobs during college," Alexander said, consulting her file again. That couldn't have been easy while maintaining
Thank
your
you for the
grades.
update.
Sarah felt a
Let's proceed
familiar
as
tightness
discussed.
in her chest when the conversation turned to money. She had learned to be matter-of-fact about her background, but it was always awkward discussing it with people who had never worried about paying rent. My family doesn't have much, Sarah said simply. My mother works as a nurse's aide, and my father drives a delivery truck. They couldn't help with college expenses, but they supported me in other ways. Alexander's expression softened, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that looked almost like pain. That must have required a lot of sacrifice, he said quietly. It was worth it, Sarah replied. My parents always told me that education was the one thing no one could take away from me. For a moment, the conference room was completely silent except for the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Alexander was looking at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read, but it made her feel like he was seeing something in her that most people missed. Sarah, Alexander said finally, and there was something different about the way he said her name. More personal, more intimate. I think you're going to do very well here. Before Sarah could respond, the conference room door opened, and a man in his 50s appeared with a tablet and a concerned expression. Alex, I'm sorry to interrupt, the man said, but the Tokyo call moved up by an hour. They're waiting for you now. Alexander's jaw tightened with what looked like frustration, but he stood up smoothly. Of course, he said. Then, he turned back to Sarah, who had also risen from her chair. Sarah, this is David Chun, my chief operating officer, Alexander said. David, this is Sarah Martinez, our new strategic planning intern. David shook Sarah's hand with a professional smile, but she noticed that his attention seemed more focused on Alexander than on her. There was something in his expression that suggested he was curious about why the CEO was personally meeting with an intern. Jennifer is waiting to show you to your workstation, Alexander said to Sarah, but his eyes lingered on her face as if he was reluctant to end the conversation. I look forward to seeing your work. As Sarah gathered her briefcase and headed toward the door, she felt Alexander's gaze following her. When she glanced back, she found him watching her with that same intense focus that had unsettled her from the moment he walked into the room. Sarah, Alexander called just as she reached the door. She turned around, and for a moment he seemed to struggle with what he wanted to say. If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask. There was something in his tone that went beyond normal corporate mentorship. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and followed David out of the conference room. As they walked down the hallway, Sarah tried to process what had just happened. The meeting had felt more like an intimate conversation than a professional introduction. Alexander Blackstone, one of the most successful CEOs in the country, had seemed completely focused on her in a way that was both thrilling and confusing. How long have you worked here? Sarah asked David as they waited for the elevator. 12 years, David replied. Since Alexander started the company. What's he like as a boss? Sarah found herself asking, though she wasn't sure why. David glanced at her with a thoughtful expression. Brilliant. Demanding. Fair. He expects a lot, but he gives a lot in return. He paused as the elevator doors opened. I've never seen him take such a personal interest in an intern before. Sarah felt her cheeks warm as they stepped into the elevator. He was just being polite, she said, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. David smiled, but didn't comment. As the elevator descended toward the strategic planning department on the 35th floor, Sarah found herself thinking about the way Alexander had looked at her. Like she was someone worth paying attention to. Like she mattered. She had expected her first day at Blackstone Enterprises to be overwhelming because of the workload and the pressure to prove herself. She hadn't expected it to be overwhelming because the CEO himself had left her feeling completely off balance. The elevator doors opened, and Sarah stepped into her new professional life, carrying with her the memory of intense green eyes and a conversation that had felt like something much more than a standard business meeting. Jennifer was waiting by the elevator with a warm smile, and a security Sarah's first week at Blackstone Enterprises passed in a whirlwind of orientation sessions, training modules, and getting acquainted with the company's project management systems. She threw herself into the work with determination, arriving early and staying late to make sure she understood every detail of her assignments. The strategic planning department occupied a prime corner of the 35th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular views of Puget Sound. Sarah's workspace was a modern cubicle with a high-end computer, dual monitors, and ergonomic furniture that was more comfortable than anything she had ever owned. Her supervisor, Maria Santos, was a sharp woman in her 40s who had worked her way up from an entry-level analyst position. Maria had a reputation for being tough, but fair, and she seemed genuinely invested in helping Sarah succeed. Your first project is a market analysis for our potential expansion into the education technology sector, Maria explained on Sarah's third day, handing her a thick folder. I want you to research current trends, identify key players, and assess opportunities for Blackstone to enter the market. Sarah felt a thrill of excitement. This wasn't busy work or filing papers. This was real strategic planning that could influence the company's future direction. She dove into the research with enthusiasm, spending hours analyzing market reports, studying competitor strategies, and identifying gaps where Blackstone could add value. What she didn't expect was how often she found herself thinking about Alexander Blackstone during those long hours of research. Their meeting had lasted less than 30 minutes, but something about their conversation had stayed with her in a way that was both professional and deeply personal. She told herself that her interest was natural. Alexander was her CEO, after all, and understanding his vision for the company was part of doing her job well. But she knew that wasn't entirely true. There had been something in the way he looked at her, something in his voice when he said her name, that had nothing to do with business. On Thursday afternoon, Sarah was deep into analyzing education technology trends when her computer chimed with a new email. She glanced at the sender and felt her heart skip a beat. The message was from Alexander Blackstone himself. Sarah, I reviewed the preliminary notes you submitted on the education sector analysis. Excellent work. Could you join me for lunch tomorrow to discuss your findings? Alex. Sarah stared at the email for a full minute, reading it 3 times to make sure she understood correctly. The CEO of Blackstone Enterprises was inviting her to lunch. That definitely wasn't standard procedure for interns. She forwarded the message to Maria, asking if she should accept the invitation. Maria's response came back within minutes. Absolutely yes. This is a huge opportunity. Alex doesn't invite interns to lunch. Ever. Friday morning crawled by as Sarah tried to focus on her work while anticipating the lunch meeting. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a navy blue dress that was professional but flattering, paired with a blazer and low heels that wouldn't make walking awkward. At exactly noon, Alexander appeared at her cubicle, looking impeccable in a dark suit that had obviously been tailored specifically for him. Sarah noticed that several of her colleagues glanced up from their computers with curious expressions. Ready? Alexander asked, and Sarah was struck again by how his voice seemed to affect her nervous system. Yes, sir, Sarah replied, grabbing her purse and notebook. As they walked toward the elevator, Sarah was acutely aware of Alexander's presence beside her. He was tall enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes, and she caught a subtle scent of expensive cologne that was somehow both professional and intimate. I thought we'd go to Elliot's, Alexander said as they waited for the elevator. It's quiet enough for conversation, and they have excellent seafood. Sarah nodded, though privately she wondered if a place that Alexander Blackstone considered appropriate for business lunch would be far beyond her usual budget. She had brought enough cash for a reasonably priced meal, but she suspected that excellent seafood in downtown Seattle carried a premium price tag. Elliot's Oyster House was an upscale restaurant with crisp white tablecloths, attentive waitstaff, and a wine list that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly grocery budget. The hostess recognized Alexander immediately and led them to a corner table with a view of the waterfront. Order whatever you like, Alexander said once they were seated, apparently noticing Sarah's careful study of the menu. Lunch is on the company. Sarah felt a flush of relief and mild embarrassment. She was still learning to navigate these professional situations where money was no object for her companions, but represented careful calculation for her. Thank you, she said, choosing the salmon special, which seemed appropriately professional without being the most expensive item on the menu. Alexander ordered the same thing, along with a bottle of sparkling water and what appeared to be his usual interactions with the waitstaff. Sarah noticed that he was polite and direct with the servers, treating them with the same respect he would show business colleagues. "So," Alexander said once they had ordered, turning his full attention to Sarah. "Tell me what you've discovered about the education technology market." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah presented her preliminary findings with growing confidence. She had prepared talking points, but Alexander's questions pushed her to think deeper about the implications of market trends and potential strategic opportunities. "The market is fragmented," Sarah explained, "but there's a real need for integrated solutions that can work across different types of educational institutions. Most companies are focused on either K-12 or higher education, but not both." Alexander nodded, his green eyes focused intently on her face as she spoke. "What would an integrated approach look like?" "A platform that could adapt to different age groups and learning environments," Sarah said, warming to the topic. "Imagine software that could support a third grader learning basic math and a college student studying advanced calculus with the same underlying architecture, but different interfaces and capabilities." "Interesting," Alexander said, leaning forward slightly. "What would be the biggest technical challenge in developing something like that?" Sarah launched into an explanation of scalability and user experience design, noting how Alexander's questions consistently pushed her to think beyond surface-level analysis. He seemed genuinely interested in her ideas, treating her insights as valuable rather than dismissing them as the work of an inexperienced intern. Their food arrived, but the conversation continued seamlessly. Sarah found herself relaxing as she realized that Alexander was genuinely enjoying their discussion. He wasn't just being polite or testing her knowledge. He seemed to find her perspective genuinely valuable. "You mentioned in your notes that most education technology companies are missing opportunities in vocational training," Alexander said between bites of salmon. "Can you elaborate on that?" "Traditional four-year college isn't the right path for everyone," Sarah said, thinking of several of her high school classmates who had struggled with academic expectations but excelled at hands-on work. "There's huge demand for skilled technicians, healthcare workers, and trade professionals, but the training programs are often using outdated methods." Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "What would modern vocational training look like?" "Virtual reality simulations for dangerous procedures, AI tutors that adapt to individual learning styles, mobile apps that let students practice skills anywhere," Sarah replied. "The technology exists, but nobody's putting it all together in a way that's accessible and affordable." "Accessible and affordable," Alexander repeated, and Sarah noticed something shift in his expression. "Those aren't usually priorities for technology companies." "They should be," Sarah said firmly. "The people who need these training programs most are often the ones with the least resources. If we only develop solutions for wealthy institutions, we're missing the opportunity to make a real difference." Alexander was quiet for a moment, studying Sarah's face with that intense focus she was beginning to recognize. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "You really believe technology should serve everyone, not just people who can afford premium solutions," he said. "Yes," Sarah replied without hesitation. "What's the point of innovation if it only benefits people who are already privileged?" Alexander smiled, and Sarah felt her pulse quicken. There was something about his smile that made her feel like she had just said exactly what he hoped to hear. "That's not a common perspective in this industry," Alexander said. "Most people are focused on maximizing profit margins and targeting high-end clients." "I understand the business realities," Sarah said, "but I think there's a way to do both. Build sustainable business models that can serve different market segments." "How would you structure something like that?" Alexander asked, and Sarah realized that this had moved beyond casual lunch conversation. He was asking her opinion on serious strategic questions. For the next hour, they discussed business models, market segmentation, and social impact investing. Alexander shared insights from his own experience building Blackstone from a small consulting firm into a global corporation, and Sarah found herself offering perspectives that seemed to genuinely surprise him. "Most business school graduates I interview can recite theories about market strategy," Alexander said as their lunch plates were cleared away. "But they've never actually experienced the problems they're trying to solve." "You have." Sarah felt a warm glow of pride, but also a growing awareness that something was happening between them that went beyond professional mentorship. Alexander's attention was so focused, so personal, that it felt almost intimate. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said, gathering her courage. "Of course," Alexander replied. "Why did you invite me to lunch?" "I mean, I'm grateful for the opportunity, but this doesn't seem like something you usually do with interns." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah wondered if she had overstepped some professional boundary. But when he looked at her, his expression was thoughtful rather than annoyed. "Honestly," Alexander said finally, "I was impressed by your perspective during our first meeting, and after reading your preliminary research, I wanted to understand how you think about complex problems." He paused, and Sarah sensed there was more he wasn't saying. "Most people in this business think about technology as a way to create efficiency or generate revenue," Alexander continued. "You think about it as a way to solve human problems. That's rare." Sarah felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze. "Thank you," she said. "That means a lot, coming from you." Alexander smiled again, and this time Sarah noticed that his eyes lingered on her face in a way that felt distinctly personal. "I have a feeling you're going to accomplish great things, Sarah Martinez." The way he said her name sent a little shiver down Sarah's spine. There was something in his voice that suggested he was thinking about more than just her professional potential. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Alexander's phone buzzed with what appeared to be an urgent message. He glanced at the screen, and his expression tightened. "I'm sorry," he said to Sarah. "There's an issue with our London office that I need to handle immediately." "Of course," Sarah said, though she felt oddly disappointed that their lunch was ending. As they walked back toward the Blackstone building, Sarah was surprised when Alexander slowed his pace to match hers. Despite the urgent business issue, he didn't seem to be in a hurry to end their time together. "Sarah," Alexander said as they reached the building's lobby, "I'd like to invite you to our board meeting next week. We'll be discussing potential new market opportunities, and I think your perspective on education technology could be valuable." Sarah's eyes widened. "A board meeting? Are you sure? I'm just an intern." "You're an intern with insights that could influence our strategic direction," Alexander replied. "Besides, it will be good experience for you." Sarah nodded, trying to process the fact that after 1 week at Blackstone Enterprises, she was being invited to participate in board-level discussions. "Thank you," she said. "I won't let you down." Alexander stepped closer, and Sarah caught that subtle scent of his cologne again. "I'm sure you won't," he said quietly. For a moment, they stood facing each other in the busy lobby, and Sarah felt like the rest of the world had faded away. Alexander's green eyes were focused entirely on her, and she had the strange sense that he was about to say something important. But then, his phone rang, breaking the spell. Alexander glanced at the screen and sighed. "London can't wait any longer," he said with what sounded like regret. "Have a good afternoon, Sarah." As Sarah rode the elevator back to the 35th floor, she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The lunch had started as a business discussion, but by the end it had felt like something much more personal. Alexander Blackstone was brilliant, successful, and undeniably attractive. He was also her boss's boss, a man with more power and influence than Sarah had ever encountered. Whatever she thought she had sensed during their conversation was probably just her imagination. But as she returned to her cubicle and tried to focus on her research, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of the way Alexander had looked at her when he said goodbye. Like she was someone he didn't want to stop talking to. Like she was someone who mattered to him in a way that had nothing to do with business. Maria appeared at Sarah's desk within minutes of her return, her expression curious and slightly concerned. "How was lunch?" Maria asked, settling into the guest chair next to Sarah's workstation. "Educational," Sarah replied, which was true without being complete. "Alex Blackstone doesn't take interns to lunch," Maria said bluntly. "Ever. In the 12 years I've been here, I've never heard of him doing anything like this." The Blackstone Enterprises boardroom occupied the entire north side of the 42nd floor, with a massive table made of polished walnut and leather chairs that probably cost more than most cars. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided a panoramic view of Seattle's skyline, with Mount Rainier visible in the distance on this unusually clear morning. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, clutching her presentation materials and trying to calm her nervous energy. She had spent the weekend refining her education technology proposal, working through multiple drafts until every slide was perfect and every recommendation was backed by solid research. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock, and Sarah had been instructed to present her findings as the first item on the agenda. She had never presented to a corporate board before, and the thought of addressing some of the most powerful executives in the Pacific Northwest was both thrilling and terrifying. "You're early," a familiar voice said behind her. Sarah turned to find Alexander standing in the doorway, looking impeccable in a navy suit with a subtle pinstripe pattern. His tie was a deep blue that brought out the green of his eyes, and Sarah noticed that he seemed more relaxed than she felt. "I wanted to make sure everything was set up correctly," Sarah replied, gesturing toward the presentation screen and her neatly organized notes. Alexander smiled and walked over to where she stood at the head of the table. "Nervous?" he asked, and Sarah appreciated that he didn't try to pretend this was just another routine presentation. "A little," Sarah admitted. "I've never presented to a board before." "They're just people," Alexander said, stepping close enough that Sarah could catch the subtle scent of his cologne. "Smart people who are interested in hearing good ideas. Which you have." Something in his tone made Sarah look up at him, and she found him watching her with that intense focus she was beginning to recognize. There was confidence in his expression, but also something that looked almost like pride. "You believe in this proposal?" Alexander said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Sarah replied without hesitation. "I think Blackstone could make a real difference in education technology while building a profitable business." Alexander nodded slowly, his green eyes never leaving her face. "That's what I hoped you'd say." Before Sarah could ask what he meant by that, the boardroom door opened and other executives began filing in. Sarah recognized some of them from the company website and business news articles, but seeing them in person was intimidating. David Chun, the COO, entered first, followed by Patricia Williams, the Chief Financial Officer, and Robert Kim, who headed international operations. Behind them came 3 external board members, including Margaret Foster, who had previously been CEO of a major technology company, and James Morrison, a venture capitalist with a reputation for identifying promising startups. Alexander took his seat at the head of the table, and Sarah noticed that he had positioned her presentation area so that she would be facing him directly during her talk. When their eyes met across the table, he gave her a small nod of encouragement that somehow steadied her nerves. "Good morning, everyone," Alexander said once the board members had settled into their chairs. "Today we're going to hear from Sarah Martinez, our newest strategic planning intern, about potential opportunities in the education technology market." Sarah felt a flutter of surprise at being introduced as their newest strategic planning intern rather than just an intern. It was a subtle distinction, but it positioned her as a valued team member rather than a student observer. "Sarah has completed an extensive market analysis," Alexander continued, "and her findings have some interesting implications for our growth strategy." Sarah stood up, grateful that her voice remained steady as she began her presentation. "Thank you, Mr. Blackstone. Board members, thank you for your time this morning." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah walked through her analysis with growing confidence. She had organized her findings into clear sections: market size and growth trends, competitive landscape, unmet needs in different education sectors, and specific opportunities where Blackstone could add value. The board members asked thoughtful questions, and Sarah was pleased to discover that her research was thorough enough to address their concerns. Margaret Foster was particularly interested in the technical challenges of developing integrated solutions, while James Morrison focused on potential return on investment. "What sets this market apart from other technology sectors we've considered?" Patricia Williams asked. "The potential for social impact alongside financial returns," Sarah replied. "Education technology has the unique characteristic of creating value that extends far beyond the immediate customer. When we help a school improve student outcomes or enable a vocational program to train skilled workers more effectively, we're contributing to broader economic and social benefits." Sarah noticed Alexander leaning forward slightly, his attention completely focused on her response. There was something in his expression that suggested her answer had particular significance for him. "That's an idealistic perspective," Robert Kim observed, though his tone wasn't dismissive. "How do we quantify social impact when making business decisions?" Sarah had anticipated this question, and was ready with a detailed answer about metrics, long-term market positioning, and the growing importance of corporate social responsibility in attracting both customers and top talent. As she spoke, Sarah became aware that the dynamics in the room had shifted. What had started as a formal presentation was becoming an engaged strategic discussion. The board members were treating her insights seriously, building on her ideas, and exploring implications for broader company strategy. The most interesting aspect of Sarah's analysis, Alexander said when she had finished presenting, is her identification of underserved market segments that other companies have overlooked. Specifically, vocational training and community colleges, Sarah added. These institutions need advanced technology solutions, but they've been ignored by most developers because their budgets are smaller than major universities or large school districts. But there are a lot more of them, Margaret Foster noted, studying the market data Sarah had compiled. If we could develop scalable solutions at appropriate price points, the aggregate market could be substantial. Exactly, Sarah said, feeling a surge of excitement that the board was grasping the strategic opportunity she had identified. It's not about competing for the same high-end clients as everyone else. It's about expanding the market by serving customers that others have dismissed. James Morrison looked up from his notes with an expression of interest. What would be our competitive advantage in this space? Sarah glanced at Alexander, who nodded encouragingly. Our expertise in digital transformation for traditional industries, she replied. Educational institutions are notoriously resistant to change, especially smaller ones with limited IT resources. We know how to help organizations adopt new technologies without disrupting their core operations. And we have a track record of developing solutions that actually work in practice, not just in theory, David Chin added, clearly warming to the concept. For the next 30 minutes, the board engaged in the kind of strategic discussion that Sarah had only read about in business school case studies. They explored implementation timelines, resource requirements, potential partnerships, and risk mitigation strategies. Sarah found herself contributing actively to the conversation, offering insights about user experience design, market entry strategies, and competitive positioning. She noticed that Alexander seemed particularly pleased when she demonstrated deep understanding of both technical requirements and business realities. This is exactly the kind of thinking that has made Blackstone successful, Alexander said as the discussion began to wind down. Identifying opportunities that others miss because they're focused on obvious markets. Patricia Williams looked up from her financial calculations. The numbers are compelling, she said. If Sarah's market analysis is accurate, this could represent significant revenue growth over the next 3 to 5 years. What would be our next steps? Margaret Foster asked. Alexander turned to Sarah with an expression that was both professional and oddly personal. Sarah, what would you recommend? Sarah felt a moment of surprise at being asked to outline strategy recommendations to the board, but she had thought through implementation plans as part of her research. I'd recommend starting with a pilot program, she said. Partner with 3 or 4 vocational training institutions that are eager to innovate. Develop a basic platform that addresses their most pressing needs. Then, use their feedback to refine our approach before expanding to other market segments. How long would a pilot program take? Robert Kim asked. 6 to 9 months for development and initial testing, Sarah replied. Another 3 months for evaluation and refinement. We could have a scalable product ready for broader market entry within 12 to 15 months. James Morrison nodded approvingly. That's a reasonable timeline. What about staffing requirements? Sarah launched into a detailed discussion of team composition, skill requirements, and project management structure. She had clearly thought through every aspect of implementation, and the board seemed impressed by the thoroughness of her planning. As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had experienced before. She had not only presented her research effectively, but had participated in high-level strategic planning that could influence the company's future direction. Thank you, Sarah, Alexander said as the board members began gathering their materials. Excellent work. But Sarah noticed that while his words were formally professional, his eyes held a warmth that felt distinctly personal. Several board members also offered congratulations as they filed out of the conference room, with Margaret Foster mentioning that she hoped to see more of Sarah's work in future meetings. Within minutes, Sarah found herself alone with Alexander in the spacious boardroom. He was still seated at the head of the table, studying her with that intense focus that never failed to make her pulse quicken. "How do you feel?" Alexander asked. "Energized," Sarah replied honestly. "I've never been part of strategic planning at this level before. It's exciting to see how ideas can become real business initiatives." Alexander smiled, and Sarah noticed that his entire demeanor had relaxed now that the formal meeting was over. "You did exceptionally well," he said. The board was genuinely impressed. "Thank you," Sarah said, though she sensed there was something more he wanted to say. Alexander stood up and walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of her. Sarah was acutely aware of how much taller he was, and how the morning light from the windows seemed to highlight the strong lines of his jaw and the intensity of his green eyes. "Sarah," Alexander said, and there was something in his voice that was definitely not professional. "Would you have dinner with me tonight?" Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "Dinner?" she repeated, making sure she understood correctly. "Not a business dinner," Alexander clarified, his eyes never leaving her face. "A personal dinner. Just the two of us." For a moment, Sarah couldn't find her voice. Alexander Blackstone, her CEO, was asking her on what sounded very much like a date. The rational part of her mind was already listing all the reasons why this was a terrible idea, but a larger part of her was focused on how he was looking at her like she was the most interesting person he had ever encountered. Sarah began, then stopped, uncertain how to respond. "I know this is complicated," Alexander said quietly. "I know there are professional considerations. But I also know that what I felt when I met you has nothing to do with business." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Alexander was being completely direct about his personal interest in her, which was both thrilling and terrifying. "What did you feel?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander stepped closer, and Sarah caught the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with something that was purely him. "Like I was meeting someone I'd been waiting for without realizing I was waiting," he said. The honesty in his voice made Sarah's heart race. She had sensed that there was something personal in his attention, but hearing him admit it directly was overwhelming. "Alexander," Sarah said, using his first name for the first time. "I'm an intern. You're the CEO. This could create problems for both of us." "You're right," Alexander replied. "It could. But I've never met anyone like you, Sarah. And I don't think I can pretend that this is just professional interest." Sarah looked into his green eyes and saw something that looked like vulnerability beneath his usual confidence. Alexander Blackstone, who commanded boardrooms and built business empires, seemed almost uncertain as he waited for her response. "One dinner," Sarah heard herself saying. "Somewhere private where we won't run into colleagues." Alexander's smile was radiant. "I know exactly the place," he said. "Quiet, excellent food, and completely discreet." As they made arrangements for him to pick her up that evening, Sarah felt like she was stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. She was about to have dinner with the most powerful man she had ever met, a man who seemed to see something special in her that she wasn't even sure existed. But as she looked at Alexander's face, seeing the genuine pleasure in his expression, Sarah realized that whatever risks this might create, she was too curious about where this could lead to walk away. "I'll see you tonight," Alexander said as they prepared to leave the boardroom. "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "You will." As Sarah returned to her cubicle, trying to focus on her regular work while processing the morning's events, she had no idea that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. Alexander Blackstone was interested in her, personally and romantically. The most successful man she had ever met saw something in her that made him willing to risk professional complications. Tonight, she would find out exactly what that meant. Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety. "Do you think I did something wrong?" "The opposite," Maria said with a small smile. "I think you made quite an impression. The question is, what kind of impression?" Before Sarah could ask what Maria meant by that, her computer chimed with another email from Alexander. "Sarah, thank you for an insightful discussion today. Blackstone," she asked as they walked toward a cluster of cubicles near the windows. "Interesting," Sarah replied, which was the most honest answer she could give without explaining that she felt like her entire understanding of professional relationships had just been turned upside down. He doesn't usually spend that much time with new team members, Jennifer observed. You must have made quite an impression. Sarah wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she simply smiled and tried to focus on learning about her new workspace. But, as Jennifer showed her the office layout and introduced her to her colleagues, Sarah found her thoughts drifting back to the conference room and the man who had watched her with such unexpected intensity. She had a feeling that her internship at Blackstone Enterprises was going to be much more complicated than she had ever imagined.